Chapter 6. What are you thinking about? The question asked by all couples, all those who live side by side for years observing each other, who, coming against an unreadable expression or look, can't help timidly inquiring, "What are you thinking about?" Admittedly, Madame Maigret only asked the question when she sensed her husband was relaxed, as if there was a zone she knew she was not allowed to enter. After the long telephone call to La Rochelle, there had been the calm of dinner, in the restful white hotel dining room with its potted plants and its bottles of wine and flowers on the tables. Nobody appeared to take any notice of the Maigret, even though they were still the object of a discreet curiosity, both admiring and affectionate. Now it was their evening stroll. Rumbles of thunder could be heard somewhere in the sky, and suddenly the still air was whipped up by gusts of wind. As if automatically, they'd walked down Rue du Bourbonnais, where there was a light at one of the first-floor windows, in plump Madame Virevaux's room. The Molesky were out, either on a walk or at the cinema. The ground floor was dark and silent. The furniture was back in place. Hélène Lange had been erased. One day, probably, the contents of the house would be piled up on the pavement, and a jaunty auctioneer would sell off everything that had been the trappings of a life. Had Francine taken the photographs? It was unlikely. It was also unlikely that she'd send for them. They would be auctioned off along with everything else. They were walking in the direction of the park, where walks almost inevitably ended up, when Madame Maigret had asked her question. "I was thinking that Lecoeur is an excellent investigator," replied her husband. The questions the chief inspector from Clermont-Ferrand had fired off, without allowing Francine the time to collect herself, were calculated to fluster her. He'd got the very most out of the facts in his possession, and obtained tangible results that would provide a basis for the next stages of the investigation. Why was Maigret not entirely satisfied? He would have taken a different approach, probably. Two men, even if they apply the same method, do things differently, but this wasn't about method. Deep down, Maigret envied his colleague's brilliance, his assurance, his self-confidence. For Maigret, the lady in lilac was not simply the victim of a murder, nor a person who had led a particular type of existence. He was beginning to know her, and he was trying, almost unwittingly, to learn more about her. It was the story of the two sisters that was uppermost in his mind as he walked, whereas a carefree Lecoeur had cheerfully gone off to his appointment with the examining magistrate. What could the latter really know about the case, cloistered in his chambers, where everything that had been alive was summed up in the formal language of official reports? Two sisters, in a village on the Atlantic coast, in a shop near the church. Maigret knew that village, where people worked both the land and the sea. 4 or 5 large-scale operators owned the oyster farms and mussel beds. He pictured the women, young and old, including little girls, setting out in the early hours, sometimes in the dark, depending on the tides. Wearing rubber boots, they were dressed in thick woolens and cast-off men's jackets. On the beach, they gathered the oysters from the exposed beds, while the men collected the mussels clustered in ropes spiraling around posts. Most of the girls didn't have their school certificate, and the boys had barely gone further. In any case, that's how it was when the Lange sisters lived in the village. Hélène was an exception. She had gone to school in the town, and had gained enough of an education to land an office job. Setting off on her bicycle in the morning and coming home in the evening, she was a young lady. And later her sister must have found a way to get by too, mustn't she? "They're both in Paris. They aren't seen around the village anymore. They look down on us." Their former friends continued to scrabble around in the oyster beds in the morning and to collect mussels. They had married and raised children who now played in Place de l'Église. Hélène Lange had achieved her ambitions by dint of a steely determination. Very young, she had rejected the life she'd been destined for, and carved out a different path, choosing a personal world illustrated in her eyes by a few romantic novelists. Balzac was too harsh for her, too close to Marsilly, to the family shop and the mussel beds, where the cold froze your hands. Francine had escaped too, in her own way. At 15, a taxi driver had deflowered her, and she didn't see why she shouldn't be liberal with her attractive, curvaceous body, why she shouldn't use her provocative smile to entice men. Hadn't they both, ultimately, been successful? The owner of the house in Vichy had a large sum of money in the bank, and the younger sister, back home, flaunted her wealth by owning the town's best beauty salon. Did Lecoeur not feel the need to live with them, to understand them? He established the facts, made deductions, and, consequently, felt no qualms. A man was mixed up in these two lives, a man whose face no one knew, but who was somewhere there in Vichy, in his hotel room, in an avenue in the park, or in a room of the Grand Casino. That man had killed. He was hunted. He could not be unaware that the police, with the huge resources at their disposal, were imperceptibly closing in on him and would narrow the field until the moment when an indifferent hand would come down on his shoulder. He, too, had a life behind him. He had been a child, a young man, in love, probably married, because the stranger who visited Rue Notre-Dame de Lorette in Paris 1 or 2 evenings a week only stayed there for an hour. Helene disappeared and resurfaced, alone, in Nice, where she seems to have voluntarily lost herself in the anonymous crowd. Before that, she made a detour via a little village in Burgundy, staying for a month at an inn with her sister who had given birth. That man, too, Maigret needed to know him. He was tall and strong. His asthma, for which he was probably receiving treatment, gave him a distinctive voice. He had killed for nothing. He had gone to Rue de Bourbonnais not to kill but to ask a question. Hélène Lange had held her tongue. Even when he'd grabbed her throat to scare her, she'd refused to speak, and she had paid for her silence with her life. He could have given up. Caution demanded it. Any move on his part became risky. The police machine had been set in motion. Did he already know she had a sister, Francine Lang? She claimed he didn't, and that was possibly true. He had learned of her existence, and that she had just arrived in Vichy from the press. He got it into his head to contact her, employing all his patience and cunning to find out the name of the hotel where she was staying. Whereas Hélène had refused to talk, would the younger sister resist the lure of a large sum of money? The man was rich, important. Otherwise, how would he have transferred more than 500,000 francs over the past few years? 500,000 francs in exchange for nothing. He received nothing. He didn't even know the whereabouts of the woman to whom he sent the money in cash to the different poste restante addresses indicated by her. Otherwise, would Hélène Lange not have been dead sooner? Stay in Vichy for another 2 or 3 days. He tried his last chance, at the risk of getting caught. He was going to telephone. He was perhaps doing so. It all depended on when he could give his wife the slip for a moment. Now, one of Lecoeur's men was watching the public telephone booths. Had Maigret been wrong in thinking that he wouldn't call from a café or bar, or from his hotel room? He and his wife walked past one of those call boxes. Through the glass, they could see a very young girl talking excitedly. "Do you think he'll get caught?" "Very soon, yes." Because this man wanted something too desperately. Who knows whether he hadn't been living for years with this obsession, since, each month, he had been sending money constantly hoping for this coincidence that had taken 15 years to occur? He was perhaps an excellent businessman who never lost his composure in his day-to-day life. 15 years dwelling on one fixation. He had squeezed hard, without intending to kill. Unless... Maigret stopped in his tracks in the middle of an avenue, and his wife automatically stopped, glancing at him briefly. Unless he had found himself in the... She wasn't convinced of my strength of character. Is that the expression she used? Yes. In the end, I agreed not to see the child until he was 21. Lecoeur seemed to be asking Maigret, "What do we do?" And Maigret blinked 2 or 3 times, clenching the stem of his pipe harder between his teeth. Chapter 8. Lecoeur had sat down again, slowly. He turned to the man with the devastated expression whom he'd just made suffer so many emotions, and said, as if regretfully, "I'm afraid I have more painful news for you, Monsieur Pelado." A bitter smile seemed to be saying, "Do you think you can hurt me any more?" I have a lot of sympathy and even respect for the man you are. I'm not playing games to extract the confession which in fact we don't need. What I have to tell you, like everything I have told you so far, is the strict truth, and I am sorry that it is so brutal." A pause, to give Pelardeau time to steel himself. "You have never seen Hélène Lange's son?" He expected a fierce objection, even a violent scene. But he found himself facing a defeated soul, who did not react or utter a word. "You never suspected anything?" Pelardeau looked up, shook his head, and pointed to his throat to indicate that he couldn't speak straight away. He barely had the time to take his handkerchief out of his pocket before he was racked by an asthma attack even more violent than the last. In the silence, Maigret became aware that outside, too, silence had fallen, that the thunder had stopped, and the rain was no longer bouncing off the paving stones. "Forgive me. It did occur to you to suspect the truth, didn't it? Once. Only once. When? Here. The night when—" "How many days before had you met her?" "2 days. Did you follow her?" "From a distance, to find out where she lived. I was expecting to see her with my son, or to see him coming out of the house." "On Monday night you appeared when she was about to go inside the house." "No. I saw the lodgers go out. I knew she'd be in the park, listening to the music. She's always loved music. I had no difficulty opening the door. My hotel room key worked." "You searched through the drawers." "First of all, I saw there was only one bed." "The photos?" "Of her. Only her. I'd have given everything to come across a photo of a child. And to discover letters?" "Yes. I found myself facing an inexplicable void. Even if Philippe was at boarding school, he must—" "She caught you in her house when she returned home?" "Yes. I begged her to tell me where our son was. I remember asking her if he'd died, if he'd had an accident." "She refused to answer?" "She was calmer than I was. She reminded me of our pact. The promise to give you back your son when he was 21. "Yes. For my part, I'd sworn not to try and contact him." "Did she use to tell you about him?" "In great detail. His first teeth, his childhood illnesses, the nanny she'd hired at a time when she was unwell, then school. She gave me an almost day-by-day account." "Without mentioning the place?" "Yes. Recently he'd been saying he wanted to become a doctor, apparently." He looked at Lecoeur without false modesty. "There never was any son?" "There was. But he wasn't yours." "Another man?" Lecoeur shook his head. "It was Francine Lange who gave birth to a son in Ménilmontant. Until you told me, I didn't know, I confess, that the child had been registered as being the son of Hélène Lange. The idea must have occurred to the two sisters when Francine found herself pregnant. If I know her, her first thought must have been to get rid of the baby. But her sister had a better idea." "That flashed through my mind. I told you. That night, after begging her, I threatened. For 15 years I've dreamed about this son whom I'd get to meet one day. My wife and I don't have any children. When I learned I was a father, but what's the use?" "You put your hands round her neck?" "To frighten her, to make her talk. I shouted at her to tell the truth. I didn't think of the sister, but I was afraid the child was dead, or disabled." He let his hands dangle, as if there wasn't an ounce of energy left in his body. I squeezed hard. I didn't realize. If only her face had shown some kind of emotion. But no, she wasn't even afraid. When you read in the newspaper that her sister was in Vichy, it gave you fresh hope. If the child was alive, and if Hélène was the only person who knew where he was, there was no longer anyone to take care of him. I was expecting to be arrested from one day to the next. You must have found my fingerprints. Without being able to compare them to yours. Even so, we'd have tracked you down eventually. I had to know, to make arrangements. You telephoned different hotels, in alphabetical order. How do you know? It was child's play, but Lecoeur needed satisfaction. You called from different public phone booths. So you'd identified me? Almost. What about Philippe? Francine Lange's son was fostered shortly after his birth by a family called Berthaud, farmers in Saint-André-du-Lavion in the Vosges. With your money, the two sisters bought a hair salon in La Rochelle. Neither of them took care of the child, who continued to live in the country until, at 2.5, he fell into a pond. He's dead? Yes. But for you, he had to be kept alive, and Hélène invented his childhood, his first years at school, his games, and recently his interest in medicine. It's unspeakable. Yes, that a woman could. He shook his head. I am not doubting what you say, but something inside me refuses to accept this truth. This is not the time occurrence of a case of this kind in the annals of crime. I could cite precedents. No, he begged. He withdrew into himself, his resilience gone with nothing left to cling to. You were right earlier, when you said you didn't need a lawyer. All you need to do is tell your story to the jury. He remained completely still, his head in his hands. Your wife must be worried. In my opinion, the truth will hurt her less than what she might imagine. He appeared not to have thought about her, and he finally showed his flushed face. What am I going to tell her? I'm afraid you can't tell her anything at present. I'm not authorized to release you even for a short time. I have to take you to Clermont-Ferrand. Unless the examining magistrate objects, which would surprise me, your wife will be allowed to visit you. This thought upset Pelardeau, who eventually looked at Maigret in desperation. Couldn't you talk to her? Maigret shot a questioning glance at Lecoeur, who shrugged as if to say that it wasn't up to him. I'll do my best. You should tread softly, because for the past few years she's been suffering from a weak heart. Neither of us is young any more. Nor was Maigret. He felt old this evening. He was impatient to get back to his wife, the humdrum daily walks through Vichy and the little yellow chairs in the park. They went downstairs together. Shall I drop you off, Chief? I'd rather walk. The pavements were glistening. The black car drove off, taking Lecoeur and Pelardeau to Clermont-Ferrand. Maigret lit his pipe and mechanically thrust his hands in his pockets. The night wasn't cold, but because of the storm, the thermometer had still dropped by several degrees. Water was dripping from the two shrubs flanking the entrance to the Hôtel de la Bérésina. It's you at last, sighed Madame Maigret, getting out of bed to greet him. I dreamed you were at Quai des Orfèvres, carrying out an interrogation that went on forever, and having endless glasses of beer brought up. After watching him for a moment, she murmured, Is it over? Yes. Who is it? A very respectable man, who employs thousands of office staff and workers, but who remained very unworldly. I hope you'll be able to sleep tomorrow. I'm afraid not. I have to go and explain to his wife. She doesn't know? Number. Is she here? At the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs. What about him? In half an hour, he'll be inside Clermont-Ferrand prison. While he got undressed, she carried on watching him, finding there was something strange about him. How many years do you think he'll... And Maigret, filling his last pipe of the day, from which he only took a few puffs before getting into bed, said, I hope he'll be acquitted. There was a bar on the corner of the street, but there was no question of diving out into the deluge. As for Maigret, the word beer brought a resigned smile to his lips. He had promised Rayan. He was keeping his word. Shall we go back up? They found the officer leaning against the wall. He straightened up with alacrity and stood to attention while the prisoner looked from one to the other. Thank you, officer. You may go. Lecoeur sat down at his desk and rearranged the notepad, pencil, and telephone. I gave you a few minutes to think, Monsieur Pelardeau. I don't want to pester you with questions designed to confuse you. For the time being, I'm trying to get an idea. It isn't easy to enter directly into a man's life without making mistakes. He was seeking the right note, like the musicians in the orchestra pit before the curtain goes up, and the man looked at him attentively, but without any visible emotion. You'd been married for some time, I imagine, when you met Hélène Lange? I was over 40. I was no longer a young man, and I'd been married 14 years. Was it a love marriage? That is a word which takes on a different meaning as one gets older. It wasn't a marriage of convenience. No, it was my choice. And on that matter, I have no regrets, other than the heartache I'm going to cause my wife. We are very good friends. We always have been, and I've found her extremely understanding. Even on the subject of Hélène Lange. I didn't tell her about it. Why not? He looked from one to the other. That is a subject that's difficult for me to talk about. I'm not a ladies' man. I have worked very hard during my life, and for a long time I perhaps remained quite innocent. A passion. I don't know the right word. I discovered a person who was completely different from everyone I knew. Hélène attracted me and terrified me. I found her intensity captivating. You became her lover. After a very long time. Did she make you wait? It was me. She hadn't had any affairs before me. But all this is run-of-the-mill for you, isn't it? I loved her. I thought I loved her. She asked for nothing, was content with a tiny place in my life, with those weekly visits you mentioned. There was no question of your divorcing. Never. Besides, I still loved my wife in a different way, and I would never have agreed to leave her. Poor man, he was certainly more comfortable in his offices, his factories, or chairing a board meeting. Did she leave you? Yes. Lecoeur glanced at Maigret. Tell me, Monsieur Pelardeau, have you ever been to Mesnil-le-Mont? He turned crimson, hung his head, and stammered, No. You knew she was there? Not at the time. You'd already broken up when she went there. She'd told me that she would never see me again. Why? Once more, stupefaction, incomprehension. Once more the look of a man completely at a loss. She didn't want our child to... It was Lecoeur's turn to look puzzled, whereas Maigret, ensconced in his chair, relaxed, like a big contented cat, and didn't bat an eyelid. What child are you talking about? But, Hélène's, about my son. He couldn't help saying the word son with pride. You're saying she had a child with you? Philippe, yes. Lecoeur seethed. She managed to get you to believe that... But Pelardeau patiently nodded. She didn't get me to believe anything. I have the proof. What proof? The birth certificate. Drawn up by the mayor of Mesnil-le-Mont? Naturally. It gives the mother's name as Hélène Lange. Of course. And you didn't go to see this child whom you take to be your son. Whom I take to be my son? Who is my son? I didn't go to see him because I didn't know where Hélène was giving birth. Why the mystery? Because she didn't want her child later to find himself in a situation. How can I put it? A difficult situation. You don't think that those qualms are old-fashioned? For some people, perhaps. Hélène, too, in that sense, was old-fashioned. She had strong views on... Listen, Monsieur Pelardeau, I think I'm beginning to understand. But we'll have to put the question of views aside for the time being. I apologize for becoming brutal. The facts exist, and we can't do anything about them, neither you nor I. I don't see what you're suggesting. A vague anxiety was becoming apparent beneath his external self-assurance. Do you know Francine Lange? No. You never met her in Paris? Never, nor anywhere else. Were you unaware that Hélène had a sister? No. She mentioned she had a younger sister. They were orphans. Hélène had to leave school in order to work so that her sister... Unable to contain himself, Lecoeur jumped up, remaining on his feet, and if the office had been bigger, he would have started pacing up and down furiously. Go on! Go on! He wiped his hand across his brow. So that her sister could receive the education that she deserved. That she deserved, eh? Don't hold it against me, Monsieur Pelardeau. I'm going to hurt you a great deal. I ought perhaps to go about it differently, prepare you for the truth. What truth? Her sister, at 15, worked in a hair salon in La Rochelle, and was the mistress of a taxi driver, before having I don't know how many lovers. I read her letters. Whose? Francine's. She was at a famous Swiss boarding school. Did you go there? No, of course not. Did you keep those letters? I only skimmed them. And during that time, Francine was a manicurist in a luxury hotel on the Champs-Élysées. Are you beginning to understand? Everything that you saw was a fabrication. The man was struggling, but his features, still set, were beginning to slacken, and his mouth suddenly made such a pathetic grimace that Maigret and Lecoeur looked away. "It isn't possible," he stuttered. "Sadly, it's the truth." "But why?" It was a last appeal to destiny, for them to tell him straight away that it wasn't true, for them to admit that the police were making up these disgusting stories in order to fluster him. "Forgive me, Monsieur Pelardeau. Until this evening, until these last few minutes, I, too, was unaware of the extent to which the two sisters had colluded." He was loath to sit down. He was still too on edge to do so. "Hélène never spoke to you of marriage?" "No." The no was already less vehement. "Even when she told you she was pregnant?" "She didn't want to destroy my household." "So she did tell you?" "Not in the way you mean. She told me she was going to disappear." "Kill herself?" "There was no question of that, because the child couldn't claim legitimacy." Lecoeur sighed and glanced at Maigret again. They understood each other. They imagined the scenes that must have taken place between Hélène Lange and her lover. "You don't believe me. I myself. Try and face up to the truth. It can only do you good. Me, at the point where I am." He indicated the walls around him as if they were the walls of a prison. "Let me finish, absurd as it may sound to you. She wanted to devote the rest of her life to bringing up our child the way she'd brought up her sister, without you ever seeing him. How would she have explained my presence? You could have been an uncle, a friend. Hélène hated lies." Suddenly there was a note of irony in his voice, which was an encouraging sign. "So she refused to allow your son to find out one day that you were his father. Later, when he reached adulthood, she would have told him." He added in his wheezing voice, "He's 15 now." Lecoeur and Maigret maintained a painful silence. "When I ran into her in Vichy, I decided to—" "Go on." "To see him, to find out where he was." "Did you find out?" He shook his head, and finally there were real tears in his eyes. "No." "Where did Hélène tell you she was going to give birth?" "In a village she knew. She didn't give the name. It was only 2 months later she sent me the birth certificate. The letter was postmarked Marseille." "How much money did you give her when she left?" "Does it matter?" "Very much. You'll see. 20,000 francs. I sent her 30,000 in Marseille. Then I insisted on giving her an allowance, so that our son could receive the best possible education." 5,000 francs a month? "Yes." "What reason did she give for asking you to send the money to different poste restante addresses? That would be pointless, wouldn't it? The man seemed to think that that was the chief inspector's business and not his. Incidentally, what branch of industry are you in?" "Wire production." They were broaching a subject he could talk about, and he provided some details, as if not to say no to everything, or routinely remain silent. "I inherited from my father a fairly modest wire works, near Le Havre. I expanded it, and built others in Rouen, and then in Strasbourg." "So you're the head of a large company?" "Yes." He sounded apologetic. "Your offices are in Paris?" "The headquarters. We have more modern offices in Rouen and Strasbourg, but I was keen to keep the old head office on Boulevard Voltaire." For him, that was the past. Within a few minutes, that evening, while a bellboy in gold-braided livery holding a note was going up in the lift, an entire part of his life had ceased to exist. He knew it, and that was perhaps why he let himself talk about it. "How long have you been married?" 30 years. "You once employed a certain Hélène Lange?" "I'd rather not answer." That was his response each time they touched on the sensitive point. "Do you realize, Monsieur Pelardeau, that you are not making my job any easier?" "I'm sorry. If you intend to deny the facts that I'm going to have to accuse you of, I'd rather know right away. I don't know what you are going to say. Do you claim you are innocent? In one way, no. Lecoeur and Maigret exchanged glances, because he had just said that terrible word simply, naturally, without a muscle of his face moving. Maigret recalled the shady areas in the park, the greenery which in some places took on surreal hues under the lamplight, the musicians in their colourful uniforms. Above all, he pictured the long, thin face of Hélène Lange, who was still, for him and his wife, just the lady in lilac. "Did you know Mademoiselle Lange?" He remained stock-still, holding his breath, as if he was suffocating. He was having an asthma attack. His face turned very red. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, opened his mouth and began to cough uncontrollably, his body bent double. Maigret was glad he wasn't in his colleague's shoes. For once, he was leaving the unpleasant task to someone else. Take your time, please." His eyes misty, he desperately tried to stop the coughing fit, which lasted several minutes. When he sat up, still crimson, he began by mopping his face. "I'm sorry." His voice was barely audible. "It happens several times a day. Dr. Ryan says that the waters will do me good." He was suddenly struck by the irony of those words. "I mean, would have done me good." They had the same doctor, he and Maigret. They had undressed in the same gloss-painted room, lain on the same bed covered in a white sheet. "You asked me?" "Whether you knew Hélène Lange?" It would be pointless to deny it. "Did you hate her?" If Maigret had been able to, he would have gestured to his colleague that he was taking the wrong tack. And indeed the man looked at Lecoeur with an astonishment that was not feigned, and for a moment this 60-year-old figure displayed an almost childlike candour. "Why?" he murmured. "Why would I have hated her?" He turned to Maigret as if seeking an ally. "Did you love her?" They were presented with an unexpected transformation. He frowned, trying to understand. The last two questions had surprised him, as if everything was being called into question. "I really don't see," he stammered. Then, once again, he looked from one to the other, letting his gaze dwell on Maigret's face. They sensed there was a misunderstanding somewhere. "You used to visit her in her apartment in Rue Notre-Dame-de-Lorette?" "Yes." He seemed to be implying, "But what does that matter?" "I presume it was you who paid the rent." He nodded discreetly. "Was she your secretary?" "One of my employees. Your relationship lasted several years." Visibly, the misunderstanding persisted. "I would go and see her once or twice a week." "Did your wife know?" "No, of course not." "She found out at one point?" "Never." "What about now?" Poor Pelardeau gave the impression of a man who was constantly banging up against the same wall. "Not now, either. It has nothing to do." "Nothing to do with what?" "With the murder. With his telephone calls." They were each speaking their own language, each pursuing their own idea, and they were all surprised that they couldn't understand one another. Chapter 7. Lecoeur's gaze lighted on the telephone sitting on the table, and he appeared to hesitate. Then he noticed a little plate with a white button, and eventually he pressed it. "May I don't know where it rings, but as long as it rings somewhere, we'll see whether someone comes." He felt the need for a break, and they waited in silence, avoiding looking at one another. Of the three men, it was perhaps Pelardeau who was the calmest, the most composed, or at least outwardly. It is true that, as far as he was concerned, the game was up, and he had nothing more to lose. After a while they heard footsteps echoing on an iron staircase, and then walking along a corridor, and another, and at last a discreet tap at the door. "Come in." A squeaky-clean young officer entered who, compared to the three middle-aged men, gave the impression of a life force. Lecoeur, who was a mere outsider there, asked him, "Are you free for a moment?" "Of course, sir. We were playing cards. Would you guard Monsieur Pelardeau during our absence?" The officer had no idea what was going on, and looked with amazement at the elegant man being foisted on him. "Gladly, sir." A few minutes later, Lecoeur and Maigret were outside on the peristyle. A canopy at the top of the steps sheltered them from the heavy rain slanting down through the darkness. "I was suffocating in there. I thought you could probably do with some fresh air, too." The huge cloud from which the flashes of lightning were coming was directly overhead, and the wind was dropping. The street was empty, except for the occasional passing car driving slowly and spraying water everywhere. The chief of the Clermont-Ferrand police judiciaire lit a cigarette and watched the rain bouncing off the concrete and making the foliage in the garden tremble. "I know that I got horribly bogged down, Chief. I should have handed over to you. What could I have done differently? You gained his trust. He'd reached a point where it seemed pointless answering your questions. He chose to say nothing, whatever happened. He's a man at the end of his tether who was no longer responding, who accepted—" "I had the impression." "You gradually wormed a few answers out of him. He started to show an interest. Then something happened, which I don't understand yet. Something you said struck me." "What?" "I don't know. All I know is that something clicked. I was watching his face all the time. Suddenly I saw an expression of utter amazement. We need to carefully weigh up all the words that were spoken. He was convinced we knew more." "That we knew what?" Maigret said nothing and puffed on his pipe. "A fact that is obvious to him, but which has eluded us. Maybe I should have recorded our interview. He would have kept quiet. You really don't want to take over the questioning, Chief. Not only would that be irregular, and later his lawyer would be able to use it against us, but I wouldn't fare any better than you. Perhaps less well. I don't know where to start, and worst of all, guilty as he is, I feel sorry for him. He's not the sort of criminal we generally have to deal with. When we left the hotel earlier, I had the sense that a whole world had just brutally closed its doors on him. He felt it too. Do you think so? He wanted to retain a certain dignity at all costs, and he would consider any pity as charity. I wonder whether he'll crack eventually. He'll talk. Tonight. Perhaps. On what ground?" Maigret opened his mouth to say something, closed it again, and went back to smoking his pipe. Then he continued evasively, "At some point, not too soon, you could mention Mesnil-le-Mont, by asking him, for example, if he's ever been there." He appeared not to attach a great deal of importance to the question. "Do you think he has?" "I couldn't say. Why would he have gone there, and what is the connection with the events in Vichy?" "A vague hunch," Maigret said apologetically. "When you're swept away by the current, you cling on to anything you can." The officer on guard duty was also young, and in his eyes the two men chatting under the canopy were prestigious figures who had reached the top of the hierarchy. "I'd gladly have downed a glass of beer." "Saying what, for instance?" "That there is someone in the lobby who has a personal message for him." "Do you think he'll come down?" "I'd bet on it." "Will you wait for us here, Dissel? There's no need for us to go into the hotel in force." Lecoeur went over to the concierge, while Maigret remained standing in the middle of the lobby, vaguely surveying the vast, almost empty lounge. All the chandeliers were lit, and, far away, in another world it seemed, 4 elderly people, 2 men and 2 women, were playing bridge with slow gestures. The distance created an unreal impression, like a scene shot in slow motion. The bellboy hurried over to the lift, an envelope in his hand. Lecoeur said wearily, "We'll see what happens." Then, as if struck by the solemn atmosphere, he removed his hat. Maigret, too, had his straw hat in his hand. Outside, the storm raged, and the rain beat down. Several people were sheltering in the doorway, only their backs visible. The bellboy wasn't gone long, and he came over to say, "Monsieur Pelardot is on his way down now." They couldn't help turning towards the lift. Maigret noticed a certain excitement in his colleague, who was smoothing his moustache between his thumb and first finger. A bell from above. The lift rose and stopped for a moment, then soon reappeared. A man with a rosy complexion and silver hair, dressed in dark clothes, stepped out. He scanned the lobby and walked towards the 2 men with a questioning look. Lecoeur had his police badge in the hollow of his palm, and he flashed it discreetly. "I should like to interview you, Monsieur Pelardeau." "Now?" It was indeed the croaky voice that had been described. The man didn't panic. He had definitely recognized Maigret, and seemed surprised to see him playing a silent part. "Now, yes, my car is outside. I'll drive you to my office." His face became less rosy. Pelardeau was around 60, but held himself very erect, maintaining a great deal of dignity in his bearing and facial expressions. "I presume there's no point refusing." "None, other than to complicate matters." A glance over at the concierge, and then at the lounge where the 4 far-off silhouettes could still be seen. A glance, too, at the driving rain. "It is unnecessary for me to go upstairs and fetch a hat or a raincoat, isn't it?" Maigret met Lecoeur's gaze and rolled his eyes upwards. It was pointless and cruel to leave Pelardeau's unsuspecting wife alone up there. It was going to be a long night, and there was little chance that her husband would be coming back to reassure her. Lecoeur muttered, "You may send a note up to Madame Pelardeau, unless she knows all about it." "No. What should I write?" "I don't know. That you're going to be detained longer than you expected." The man went over to the desk. "Have you got a piece of paper, Marcel?" He was sad, rather than overwhelmed or afraid. With the blue ballpoint pen lying on the desk, he wrote a few words and refused the envelope that the concierge held out to him. "Wait a few minutes before you take it up." "Very well, Monsieur Pelardeau." The concierge wanted to add something, cast around for something to say, but at a loss he remained silent. "This way." Lecoeur gave instructions in a low voice to Dissel, who was already soaked to the skin, and opened the rear car door. "After you." The manufacturer bent down and got into the car first. "You too, Chief." Maigret understood that his colleague didn't want to leave their prisoner alone in the back. A moment later, they were driving through the streets where some people were running while others sheltered under the trees. Some were even on the bandstand, where the musicians usually sat. The car turned into the courtyard of the police headquarters in Avenue Victoria, and Lecoeur merely needed to say a few words to the officer on guard duty. Only some of the lamps were lit in the corridors, and it felt like a long walk for Maigret. "Come in. It's not comfortable, but I'd rather not take you to Clermont-Ferrand right away." He removed his hat and wondered whether to slip off his jacket, whose shoulders, like those of the other 2 men, were wet. In comparison with the sudden coolness outside, it was very warm in the room where the air was stale. "Please sit down." Maigret went over to his corner and slowly filled his pipe without taking his eyes off the manufacturer's face. Pelardeau had sat down on a chair and waited, outwardly calm. It was a dramatic, almost heartbreaking calm, Maigret sensed. Not a muscle of the man's face moved. His eyes went from one police officer to the other, and he was probably trying to understand why Maigret was taking a back seat. Lecoeur took his time, busying himself with a notepad and pencil, and muttered as if to himself, "Your answers to my questions will not be recorded because this is not an official interrogation." The man inclined his head in consent. "Your name is Louis Pelardeau, and you are a manufacturer. You reside in Paris, Boulevard Suchet." "That is correct." "You are married, I assume?" "Yes." "Do you have children?" There was a hesitation, and he said with a strange bitterness, "Number." "Are you here for a treatment?" "Yes." "Is this the first time you have come to Vichy?" "I have driven through the town." "Never to meet a specific person?" "Number." Lecoeur inserted a cigarette in his cigarette holder, lit it, and remained silent for a good while. "You are not unaware, I presume, of the reason why I have brought you here?" Pelardeau thought, his face still inscrutable, but Maigret had already understood. His composure, his expressionlessness, was not so much self-control, but the effect of an extreme emotion. He was in a state of shock, and goodness knows how the images around him appeared to him, how Lecoeur's voice sounded to his ears. "I would rather not answer." "You followed me without objecting?" "Yes." "Were you expecting this to happen?" He turned towards Maigret as if to ask him for help. Then he repeated wearily, "I would rather not answer." Lecoeur scribbled a word on his notepad and tried a different line of attack. "Here in Vichy, you had the surprise of running into a person whom you hadn't seen for 15 years. His eyes were slightly moist, but there was no sign of tears. It was perhaps the effect of the bright light. This room at the end of a corridor was used so seldom that it barely had any furniture, and the lighting was reduced to a bare bulb dangling from a wire. This evening, when you went out with your wife, did you plan to stop to make a telephone call?" He hesitated, then nodded. "So, your wife doesn't know?" "About the phone call I had to make?" "If you like. Number. She's unaware of some of your doings?" "Absolutely." "Even so, you went into a public phone booth?" "She decided to come with me at the last minute. I didn't have the patience to wait for a new opportunity. I told her I'd left the key to our suite in the door, and that I needed to phone the concierge." "Why did you not finish dialing the number?" "I could sense I was being watched." "You didn't see anything?" "Something moved behind a tree. At the same time, I thought that making the phone call was pointless." "Why?" He didn't reply. His hands rested flat on his knees, slightly pudgy hands, white and manicured. "If you wish to smoke—" "I don't smoke. Does it bother you if we do?" "My wife smokes a lot. Too much." "You suspected that it wasn't Francine Lang who would be picking up the phone?" Once again he did not reply, but nor did he deny it. "You called her yesterday evening. You said you would ring back to arrange to meet her. I have every reason to assume that by this evening you had decided on the time and the place for this meeting." "I apologize for not being more cooperative." He had to get his breath back, and his words were interspersed with a slight wheezing from his throat. "It is not unwillingness on my part, believe me. Are you waiting to be assisted by a lawyer?" His right hand made a vague, sweeping gesture, as if to dismiss that idea. "But you will have to hire one." "I will, because the law demands it. Do you understand, Monsieur Pellardeau, that from now on you will be deprived of your freedom?" Lecoeur had been tactful enough not to utter the word prisoner, and Maigret was grateful to him. The man inspired respect in both of them, especially in that cramped office with neutral-colored walls. Sitting on a spindle chair, he looked larger than life, and he maintained an astonishing calm, an unexpected dignity. Between them they had interviewed hundreds of suspects, and it took a lot to affect them. This evening they were impressed. "I could postpone this conversation until tomorrow, but the case of something so monstrous, so unexpected, so unacceptable." "I wonder how Lecoeur will go about it," he muttered. "To do what?" "To get him to confess. First of all, they have to find him and arrest him. He'll allow himself to be arrested. It would be a relief for him not to have to seek, to cheat, to— He isn't armed, is he?" Because of his wife's question, Maigret envisaged a new prospect. Instead of surrendering, the man might decide to end it once and for all. Had Lecoeur advised his officers to tread warily? Maigret couldn't interfere. In this case he was merely a passive onlooker, staying discreetly in the background. Even if the murderer allowed himself to be arrested, why would he talk? It would make no difference to what he'd done, to the jury's decision. For them, he was a strangler, and stranglers did not inspire lenience, even less sympathy, whatever their story. "Admit that you'd like to have handled—" In Vichy she permitted herself to make observations that she would never have made in Paris. Because they were on holiday, because they were spending every hour of the day together and a closer relationship was developing between them? She could almost hear him thinking, "I wonder. No. I don't think so." Why was he worrying? He was here to cleanse his system, as Dr. Ryan called it. As a matter of fact, his appointment with the doctor was tomorrow, and for half an hour he would simply be a patient concerned about his liver, his stomach, his spleen, his blood pressure, and his dizzy spells. How old was Lecoeur? Barely 5 years younger than him. In 5 years, Lecoeur too would start thinking about retirement and asking himself how he'd spend his days. They walked past the two most luxurious hotels in Vichy, behind the casino. Limousines stood idle by the curb. A man in a dinner jacket was sitting in a garden chair beside the revolving doors, getting a breath of fresh air. A crystal chandelier illuminated the lobby with its oriental carpets and marble columns, and a concierge in a tasseled uniform was answering the questions of an elderly lady in an evening gown. It was perhaps in this hotel that the man was staying, or the one next door, or again the Pavillon Sévigné, near the Bellerive Bridge. A young bellboy, his gaze indifferent, waited by the lift. Lecoeur had attacked the weakest point, in other words, Francine Lang, and, caught off guard, she'd had a lot to say. He would most likely arrange to question her again. Would he learn anything new from her? Had she not disclosed everything she knew? One moment. I need to buy some tobacco. He walked into a noisy cafe, where most of the customers were watching the television mounted on the wall above their heads. The air reeked of wine and beer. The bald owner was continuously filling glasses, which a girl in a black dress and white apron carried over to the tables. He automatically glanced over at the telephone booth at the back of the room, next to the toilet. It had a glazed door. The booth was empty. 3 packets of shag. They weren't far from the Hôtel de la Bérésina now, and as they approached, they spotted young Dicelle on the steps. "May I have a quick word with you, Chief?" Madame Maigret went straight inside and took her key from the board. "Why don't we go for a walk?" The streets were empty. Footsteps echoed from a distance. "Did Lecoeur advise you to come and see me?" "Yes. I got him on the phone. He was at home in Clermont with his wife and children." "How many children does he have?" 3. The eldest is 18 and might become a champion swimmer." "What's going on?" "About 10 of us are watching the telephone booths. The chief inspector doesn't have enough men to have one for each booth, so we chose the ones in the center, especially those that aren't too far from the main hotels. Have you arrested someone?" "Not yet. I'm waiting for Inspector Lecoeur, who must be on his way. It all went wrong, and it's my fault. I was staking out a booth on Boulevard Kennedy. It was easy to hide, thanks to the trees." "Did a man go in to make a phone call?" "Yes. A tall, corpulent man answering to the description we'd been given. He seemed wary. He looked around him but couldn't see me. He began by dialing a number. Did I poke my head out too far? It's possible. It's also possible that he suddenly changed his mind. After dialing 3 digits, he stopped dead and came out of the booth. Did you arrest him?" "My instructions were not to arrest him under any circumstances, but to follow him. I was surprised to see him, less than 20 meters away, join a woman who was waiting for him in the shadows." "What kind of woman?" "A very elegant woman, of around 50. "Did they appear to be making an arrangement?" She took his arm, and they headed towards the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs, the hotel whose lobby and crystal chandelier Maigret had gazed at an hour earlier. "And then?" "Nothing. The man went over to the concierge, who gave him his key and wished him good night." "Did you get a close look at him?" "Fairly close. In my opinion, he's older than his wife. He must be getting on for 60. They went into the lift and I didn't see them again." "Was he in a dinner jacket?" "No. He was wearing a very well-cut dark suit. He has silver hair combed back, a rosy complexion, and I think a little white moustache." "Did you question the concierge?" "Of course. The couple is in room 105, on the first floor, a large bedroom and a lounge. It's their first year in Vichy, but they know the owner, who also has a hotel in La Baule. The man is Louis Pelardot, a manufacturer who lives in Paris, Boulevard Suchet." "Is he taking the waters?" "Yes. I asked whether he had a particular way of speaking, and the concierge confirmed that he's asthmatic. Dr. Rayan is treating both of them." "Is Madame Pelardot taking the waters too?" "Yes. They don't appear to have any children. They've met up with friends from Paris at the hotel, and they share a table in the dining room. Sometimes they go to the theatre together." "Is someone watching the hotel?" "I've put a reserve officer on guard duty until a colleague arrives at the scene, which he probably has by now. The officer, who could have told me to get lost, was very cooperative." Dissel was worked up. "What do you think? It's him, isn't it?" Maigret didn't answer right away, but took the time to rekindle his pipe. They weren't 100 meters from the house of the lady in lilac. "I think it's him," he sighed. The young inspector looked at him in amazement, because he could have sworn that Maigret said those words reluctantly. "I have to wait for my boss in front of the hotel. He should be here within the next 20 minutes. Did he ask for me to be present?" "He said you'd most likely come with me." "I'll have to tell my wife first." At the Grand Casino Theatre, the interval had discharged a huge crowd into the street, and many of the audience, especially women in flimsy dresses or gowns with plunging necklines, glanced anxiously up at the sky streaked with flashes of lightning. Low clouds scudded past, but above all, coming from the west, there was a dark, ominous-looking, almost solid mass. Outside the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs, Maigret and Dissel waited in silence, while behind his varnished wood desk, against a background of pigeonholes and dangling keys, the concierge watched them. Lecoeur arrived just as huge drops of cold rain began to fall, and the bell signalling the end of the interval was ringing. He had to carry out a few tricky maneuvers to park his car, and at last he was making his way towards them, his brow furrowed. "Is he in his room?" he asked. Dissel hastily replied, "Room 105 on the first floor. His windows overlook the street." "Is his wife there too?" "Yes. They came back together." A shape emerged from the shadows, and a police officer whom Maigret didn't know came and asked quietly, "Do I carry on watching?" "Yes." Lecoeur lit a cigarette and sheltered in the doorway. "I'm not authorized to carry out arrests between sunset and sunrise, except in cases of flagrante delicto." He recited the article from the Code of Criminal Procedure with a certain amount of irony, adding pensively, "I don't even have enough charges against him to obtain an arrest warrant." He seemed to be asking Maigret to come to his rescue, but the latter didn't react. "I don't like letting him stew all night. He must know he's been identified. Something happened that stopped him making his phone call. The presence of his wife a few meters from the phone box baffles me." He added reproachfully, "You're not saying anything, Chief?" "I have nothing to say." "What would you do in my shoes?" "I wouldn't wait either. I'd avoid going upstairs, where they're probably getting undressed. It would be more discreet to send him a note,